In my last video, I briefly introduced Project Eisenhower. If you haven't seen that yet, check it out in the show notes below after you're done with this one. In this one, I'm going to delve into the project with greater detail. Part of what I'm really excited about is that I'm just now getting started on the design, and I get to share the entirety of it from start to finish with you. I've broken down my design goals into 3 core aims: thematically incentivize players to wage war through logistics management, encourage high levels of interactivity, and make the game as simple to learn as possible. Thematically, the player should feel like they are managing a giant machine behind the curtain in order to make moves with their soldiers. As they expand, they're able to make more powerful plays, but they also open themselves up for greater disruption from the opposing player. Additionally, the player should, if they're playing correctly, make seemingly weaker moves because they make more logistical sense. I believe that player interaction has been much less of a priority among game designers during the past decade. However, in Mark Rosewater's article, 10 Things Every Game Needs, he says this about interaction. Players have to want something. The game has to make acquiring that thing challenging. The next step is making sure that everyone is playing the same game. The simplest way to do this is to give all players the same goal, making each of them an obstacle of the others. However you do this, though, it is crucial that your game interconnects the actions of the players. Now, I think it's fair to object to Mark's statement here. In fact, I'll argue the current trend of game design firmly takes a stance against heavy player interaction. 5 years ago, it wasn't uncommon to hear multiplayer solitaire thrown around as an issue. Lately, this feels less and less like a critique. One of the standout examples of this is Wingspan. In their 2022 annual stakeholder report, Stonemaier Games reported that Wingspan has sold 1,410,539 units. And if you've put one of those copies onto the table, you might have noticed that Wingspan fits pretty firmly in the camp of multiplayer solitaire. Jamie Stegmaier, who published Wingspan, is an open critic of Mark's statement about the need for deep levels of player interaction.
There are examples of games that have no interaction at all, and I think they're still very much so games. In fact, there's one that I've enjoyed quite a bit recently. The Guild of Merchant Explorers is a simultaneous game where you are building your own map, and there's no interaction at all that I can think of between players. The game basically embraced the simultaneous nature of itself, whereas if it had tried to add interaction to the game I think would have been much slower. I don't think it would have worked as well.
Jamie believes that games are more about the experience of playing it rather than the competition it brings. Now, personally, I've noticed a marked difference in how I feel about games with low interactivity in the long term. Highly interactive games age much better in my experience. With low levels of interaction, the fun in a box feels finite to me. Once I feel like I've unraveled its content and solved its puzzle, it goes back on its shelf and doesn't get revisited. Conversely, when the puzzle is woven into my opponent's actions, then playing with a specific group frequently establishes an emerging meta that makes each new game exciting. Our people definitely have a reputation at a party, and let's be honest, that reputation is well deserved. Now, one of my best friends salivates at a 30-page rulebook. A few years back, with a different game, I told him my goal was to get my rules down to a single page, front and back, and he was legitimately disappointed. He likes complex games, not simple ones. But simple doesn't have to mean shallow, and not all tabletop games should take an hour to learn. The ideal design is one where a new player never has to read rules. Now, this is a long-term goal. Clean, elegant design isn't a switch to be flipped on, but rather a shape to be carved out. That being said, I want to choose simplicity over complexity as often as I can. To build out my initial prototype, I took direct inspiration from 2 games, Century Spice Road and Ticket to Ride. Century has always been one of my favorite intro-level games. I always felt like it did a really good job of getting a player to think critically about what he is building with his engine, and I love when the loop comes together. The inspiration from Ticket to Ride is more on the level of trains. This gave me the basics of my first prototype. Do Century Spice Road, but on a map, and put in a way to build trains to move goods around faster. The first thing I designed was the map. Knowing that it wouldn't be anything close to my final design, I printed off a map of Europe and used a map of Ticket to Ride Europe to start charting out a rail system. I immediately realized I had a problem. I'm your average geographically challenged American. I can look at a map and say, here's Paris, here's Zurich. Now let's put a rail between them. but I know very little about the general geography of Europe. Like, Zurich is mountainous, I think. How mountainous is the area between Zurich and Munich? Should there be a rail there? So I opted out of the Euro map and instead went for a map of the US, where I would have a better instinctive feel for the geography. Of course, this means I can't go with a strict World War II theme, but this is a base prototype anyway. I fully expect nothing about this game to be left in the final product. So I grabbed a simple map of the US, pulled out a vanilla Ticket to Ride board, and used it to chart a rail system. I knew that I want specific goods to be produced in cities and then carried over to others to be used in different ways. So I added a colored square to each station to show what goods it can be used to produce. Map in tow, I began to make the cards to be used as my suite of actions. At this stage, I have the general flow of the game outlined in my head. At the beginning of your turn, you can move any goods you have on a movement track. If you have it on a rail network, you can move it to its destination. Otherwise, it moves one space a turn. Then you play an action card. You have to have the required city to play it with, and the action will take place in that city specifically. Each action will also have a side B, which is weaker but situational. Finally, you finish your turn by starting to ship any goods that are in a city currently. In keeping with my aim to make something that's easy to learn, I didn't want to add more rules than that. So any other actions would need to be put on the cards themselves, which I still needed to make. From here, I designed the starting hand. 5 cards that would act as permanent actions. The most important core card is the Rest and Relaxation card. When played, you return all the cards you played from your hand, and then remove a cube from every city you control. Thematically, you're feeding your troops. The next 3 core cards in the starting hand were actions I felt were crucial, but generally weaker than the other cards you'd be picking up throughout the game. Critically, the B-sides are even more important because they allow you to pick new cards from the market. And finally, I added a way to gain an initial starting location, a core card that gave you any city and then trashed itself. These 5 core cards would make up the player's basic actions throughout the game. To wrap it up, I moved on to filling out the rest of the deck, which would be shuffled and then dealt to form the market throughout the game. All in all, this is one of the more work-intensive initial prototypes I've put together. My aim with the first build was to get something on the table as fast as possible to see if it's worth pursuing. I also took a little bit of extra time to explore Midjourney by creating art for the prototype cards. On one hand, I absolutely do not recommend doing this. First prototypes should be ugly. Finding art for their components is the best way to feel like you're making progress on your design without actually doing anything. On the other hand, I wanted to get a feel for Midjourney as a program, and I felt like this was the ideal way that I could see how it would fit into my process. Plus, as anybody knows who's done this, it's a lot of fun to do. So, prototype in hand, I found some readily available playtesters who happened to be visiting from out of town, my parents. And the playtest went great. My mom was understanding the rules from pretty early on, which is a good sign for my aim to make a simple design. Additionally, I gained a pretty crucial understanding of the general flow of the game from its first iteration. Most importantly, both of us were engaged throughout the entire play, so mission accomplished. The big takeaway is the design is worth pursuing, which means I'll be back next week after I take it to my local designers guild to run another playtest. Please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Give this little channel a chance to get off the ground running. And while you're here, check out the other 2 videos I've launched with. Until next time.